Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder. And today we're going to talk about the expanding of the New Deal, aptly named the Second New Deal later in the 1930s. So, your targets today are to talk about how the New Deal promotes social and economic reform, or the Second New Deal in that matter, how New Deal legislation affects the growth of organized labor, and then the impact of Roosevelt's court packing plan, and how the New Deal was kind of stymied by the Supreme Court. So let's go ahead and get started. The Second New Deal basically talks about reform, which would be the third R of the three R's in the New Deal: relief, recovery, and reform. It addresses the problems of the elderly, the poor, the unemployed, and farmers. And it also looks to protect workers' rights. So new jobs during this time were created because not enough people had enough jobs. So they created another program called the WPA. I kind of like to think of the WPA and the PWA as very similar. The WPA comes second because it's second in alphabetical order. It's the Works Progress Administration, and it builds highways and dredges rivers, and it also funds artists because we need art during the Great Depression. We have to fund artists in order for them to create art. So these were plays, songs, art, murals. There are murals all over the place that were created during the Great Depression and the New Deal. So we also need to take artists into consideration. The New Deal really comes from the economic ideas of John Maynard Keynes, and there's a whole school in philosophy of economics called Keynesian economics. And he is an economist who argues that deficit spending is needed to end the Depression, which means spending more money than we actually have. And that would be where the government comes in. So the government does something in his theory in which he calls pump priming, which would be putting money into the hands of consumers so that they can go out and buy stuff and stimulate the economy. Still around today is the Social Security Act. If you have a job today, you more than likely pay into Social Security, a couple dollars per paycheck. It's a public pension system for the elderly. Once you hit a certain age, or this is how it's supposed to work. Some people say Social Security won't be around when you and me need it. But when you go for Social Security, you pay in out of your paycheck your whole life. Then you start to receive benefits when you hit a certain age. Used to be 65. Now I believe it's 68, and they want to raise it again here pretty soon. So Social Security also acts as unemployment insurance for people that lose their jobs, and also workers' compensation for accidents, mothers and children. So like widows, if people lose a spouse and they depended on that spouse for income, they get a Social Security check. I had a student whose father passed away, and him and his mom got a Social Security check every month because they depended on him for the money that they needed to survive, pretty much. It also helps out the blind and the disabled. It doesn't apply to everybody at first. Farmers and domestic service workers aren't included, and a lot of those are Mexicans and blacks. So it's kind of a racist system at first, but it later is expanded to cover almost everyone, and now it almost covers almost too many people. And people are saying the coffers are going to be dried up before you and me get a chance to actually cash in on it, even though we're paying into Social Security. So it's a contentious debate going on right now. And then another small program that happens during the Second New Deal is the REA, or the Rural Electrification Administration. And what this does is it's not cost efficient for a power company to run power lines out to one farm way out in the middle of nowhere. So it loans money to power companies to bring power lines to farmers so that they're able to have electricity out on the farm as well. During the New Deal, labor unions become a little bit more powerful. One of the New Deal goals is to raise the living conditions of industrial workers. So the Wagner Act is passed during the New Deal. also known officially as the National Labor Relations Act. And what it does is it gives workers the right to collective bargaining, and it makes unions a right, which greatly gives workers a lot more power. It also creates something called the National Labor Relations Board, which is still around today, so workers can file complaints against companies if they feel that they have been unfairly treated. We also passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA, which is a Bill of Workers' Rights, which talks about the minimum wage, the maximum hours of work, and it also outlaws child labor. A new union, powerful union, is also formed called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO. It's organized to represent, it's kind of split off from the AFL to represent the lower paid, ethnically diverse workers than those represented by the AFL. And then also a famous UAW, or United Auto Workers Union, organizes a sit-down strike during the New Deal and Great Depression in a GM plant, in General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan. And a sit-down strike is where workers sit at their machines, but they do not work, so that the company can't just bring in people to replace them because they're still sitting there not doing any work. Opposition to the New Deal happens through the Supreme Court officially. The Supreme Court is opposed to a lot of the New Deal. They think that it is overreaching the government's authority. So the case of the Schechter Poultry versus the United States is where the Supreme Court declares the National Industrial Recovery Act and the National Recovery Administration unconstitutional. So there's no minimum wage, there's no fair rules of competition anymore. Everything that the National Recovery Administration did is not going to happen because it unconstitutionally delegates legislative power to the president, who is in the executive branch. And then the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, is also declared unconstitutional in the case of U.S. versus Butler, because it attempts to regulate agricultural production, which is a power reserved to the states by the 10th Amendment in the Constitution. So FDR is seeing all his programs dismantled and all his work going away, so he comes up with a plan that proves to be unpopular over time, but the president is the one who picks the nominees to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court justices serve for life until they either retire or die. So when that happens, the president gets to pick a new Supreme Court justice. But of course, they have to be, through checks and balances in the Constitution, they have to be approved by a committee in the Senate. So the president wants to add 6 new justices who he would get to name. And Congress sees right through his plan. They want no part of his court packing plan, and it proves to backfire on Roosevelt. But eventually, in the second term of his presidency, people start retiring from the Supreme Court, so he is able to name new justices anyway. And he obviously will name new people who are friendly to his New Deal programs. And then finally, in 1937, another large recession happens, and unemployment rises to 20%. Just 5% lower than its high of 1932. And so Democrats, because of this, lose seats in Congress in the 1938 midterm elections. And so Republicans actually have more power now in Congress, and FDR loses a lot of the support that he had. But right now we're creeping up onto World War II, which will be the thing that ultimately ends the Great Depression in the United States. So that is all that I have for you today. Make sure that you please fill out those learning targets, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.